Hey everyone, welcome to our classroom series continuing with God and creation. Before we did truth in scripture, by the week before, I really mean this was already recorded, and then when I came back to have it uploaded, it got lost. The file was removed somehow. So you're gonna be seeing me in the same attire doing the third class immediately after this one. We post on the same day around the same time. That was intentional. It's just because for those of you who are in my group that come personally and meet a week, I want to make sure you have access to all of the information as you go. And for those of you who are hoping to join the group, then you are getting that information. The other thing with that, though, is that for those of you who are not planning to be part of the group because you can't, whether it be because you're not in the area or you are not, maybe just not able to, this is so you can understand why are there two videos posted today, the God and creation and morality and why it matters, is really just because of the fact that we had a technical issue, but now we're getting this. But with all that aside, yes, we are not doing the me recording with the group. We ended up deciding to scrap that for this particular group, but we're hoping is that as we go forth with the call to defend, as we expand and look to build up our team, that we will eventually get to have more classroom sessions that we can record and have people be part of. So that is our hope still. We still plan on doing that. It's just for this particular one, we're not going to do that, but I will still provide the slides on the screen for you all. And then, yeah, so let's get into it. So let's pull up the slides for you guys. Week 2, God and creation. So before I get started, again, we have discussion questions and stuff. I recommend that if you want to really kind of partake in this one more, to pause after each question pops up and then to write out answers or talk about it with those who are around you and then resume the video. I am, however, going to keep going as if I'm just reading it all to you for now, okay? So, discussion question number 1, does the universe have a beginning? Question 2, does God exist? How can we know that God exists if your answer is yes? Or how can we have a good reasonable response to believe that God exists? And how do we know which religion to believe when it comes to God? This last question right here we'll kind of delve into this a little bit. We're not really going to go super hot into this. That's a whole nother video by itself. But the idea is if you take some of the principles we learned from these ones, you'll see why this provides its own kind of conclusion if you let there be time to sit there and think about it. But with that in mind, we are not going to necessarily be dealing with this question in this particular video. We'll address it and we'll hopefully have another time for a video like this for that question in further detail. All right, so next one we have is creation text. I encourage you guys to go and check out each of these texts and write some notes down based on things you find in this text. And the first prompt I have up here is what are some creation related texts, and I told my group, do not tell me Genesis 1 and 2, because that's a very typical one for people to go to, and I want you to think of other ones that are in the Bible. Because while we're going in with for right now, we're presuming that Scripture is the special revelation we cling to, and we'll defend that further down the road. We kind of defended that a little bit in the first video, but we'll do a little more in-depth detail in the fourth video. But we're going to presume this is the case because I'm assuming those of you who are watching are Christians, and I want you to understand what Scripture says, and we'll use some arguments philosophically and scientifically that actually affirm those very things that Scripture says. But let's get some text examples, and I recommend again that you go check these texts out as they come up, or just wait for the whole list to come down and pull them up. First one, obviously, is Genesis 1 and 2. We then have also Job 38 through 41. Now, I will caution you, when you hit I believe it's 40 through 41, you also have to understand that part of that is dealing with God's rule over judgment and justice, chaos, the fact that it is dealing with God's justice. The first bit is dealing more with creation. The second bit is dealing more with his justice. Job is very poetic, so if you're confused by it, don't be scared off by it. Job is a very dense book. It's not one I recommend to younger believers in their faith, but it is a great book. There's a lot to find on the surface level, and there's a lot more to find as you dive into the Hebrew culture and the language that is there. Psalm 104 is another great one. We also have Proverbs 8. Isaiah 40 through 51 is a long one, but I do encourage you guys to check it out. It's scattered throughout 40 and 51. Also, Proverbs 8 is coming from the perspective of Lady Wisdom, who is a metaphorical, figurative personification of wisdom, declaring her existence prior to creation, but also describing the elements of creation. Hebrews 11, which is where we get our most blatant version of creation out of nothing. And then Hebrews 4 in reference to the seventh day. Now, there are other texts out there, but I recommend that you check out all these ones. These are good foundational ones that kind of deal a little bit more in the specifics of creation. And there are many thoughts on these, many things you can learn from them. So I encourage you guys to check these out and the other ones that are in the Bible. But ultimately, the Bible claims that all creation has a beginning point and that it was designed by God. Is this verifiable? Now, the Bible is making a claim here. We want to know if these claims from these texts and other ones, if there is good evidence for it. So I recommend that you go check out these texts before we dive in. So if you need to pause the video, go for it. Or if you want to check it out after, that's fine too. So does the universe have a beginning? Well, let's start with this. Time/history. I want to be careful with our wording here because somehow there's a before creation that implies time, but also time began when creation began. So it's kind of hard to say. So I prefer, let's just say, the history of our universe has a beginning point. Now that we do understand that as time, that's a little more of a deep, confusing question when you get to what was there before, because we don't understand if there could be a concept of before, if time began. But essentially, let's just say the beginning of our universe's history. Is this existent? Well, we can not have an infinite past for our universe's history because we would never approach now. I want you to think about it like a domino effect. If you had an infinite past of dominoes, you would never get to the point in which you can start the effect of the dominoes falling over today. You're going to be continuing to add on more dominoes to the pile or to the line or whatever it is before you eventually can just knock it over. And if it's an infinite past, you're never going to reach that. I recommend checking out William Lane Craig and Kokel and Turk as they talk a little bit about time. I know Craig does a little more in detail about time, but he presents the different theories regarding that. But Turk as well, he presents a domino effect as well, saying that we wouldn't be able to reach today because an infinite past would imply that there is no actual beginning point, which means we can't actually arrive to today because we're still trying to get to the past. There's no point in time when things could just start toppling over. But let's use this one as well, surge. All right, so second law of thermodynamics. Essentially, if things are winding down, that means someone or something had to have wound it up. Things are decaying, things are losing energy, using energy as well. And this one is pretty much like, it's a law of science, which means it is a fact of science. This is how life works. And the very fact that we have this implies that there is a beginning if things are winding down. Universe expansion rate. This was discovered by Edwin Hubble. Now, there's a few other people who were involved in this as well, but Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope in the 1920s, of which confirmed this theory that was also presented by Vestal Melvin Slipher, and he was well on his way in the 1913s, so just a couple more years before Edwin Hubble. We see that the universe is it seems to be expanding. Now, there's some debate over whether this is still accurate. And while I'm not going to throw my own opinion in the ring, I do recommend checking out Stephen C. Meyer, who goes into detail on the Joe Rogan show, actually. And he's a Christian philosopher of science / scientist. He knows a lot about the history of science, philosophy of science, and he does science himself. And he goes into detail about whether or not this is an issue for expansion rate. And he explains that there's a lot of misconceptions that came out when this one video went viral that a lot of people kind of clung to. But anyways, I digress. Then there's the radiation afterglow. This was discovered by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, accidentally discovering this in 1965. As time has gone by, the light fades from the expansion as moving away. We then have great galaxy seeds, which were discovered in 1992 by Kobe, which is a cosmic background explorer. And then we have Einstein's theory of general relativity, which what's really kind of funny is he actually tried to fudge the numbers because he was dealing with the steady state theory. Steady state is the idea that the universe is at steady state, which means it's not moving, it's not changing, it just is, and it has no beginning point. And the reason people want to hold to the steady state theory were primarily atheists, because not that there were some Christians as well, but it's primarily atheists as these discoveries were being developed, because if they keep steady state, then that removes necessarily the need to try to prove that God exists. But if the universe has a beginning, well, then we can't deal with the fact that there was a mistake and a cause, and even then, there couldn't be a mistake if there was no standard or anything beforehand. So all these things just kind of start to be implied that someone had to cause it all to exist. And so I know there's some of you out there who maybe disagree with some of the things that are being said about cosmology and creation. What I will say is this: regardless of your view over many debates in the church over these various little things, this is one what the skeptics hold to. So this is what they believe. So therefore, we can understand if we use this, we can still point to God. And even if they are wrong, their theory points to God. And if they are right, well, then their theory still points to God, because all the evidence we're finding, whether they're being interpreted with the method to try and remove God or keep God, end up pointing to God, because they depend on an outside source causing all these things. But anyways, back to general relativity. His theory, like I said, he tried to fudge numbers to disprove the idea, so that way there wouldn't be a beginning point; it would still be a steady state. But he actually was left with the fact that his equation declared and showed that space, time, and matter have a beginning point. And he admits to this, that he was corrected. And Stephen C. Meyer, again, I recommend him in this source. In his book, Return of the God Hypothesis, he goes into the historical background, I believe in chapters 3 and 4, where he discusses this specific instance with Einstein. And you also can check out Frank Turek's I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist, and we'll get into Craig's book in a second. But how can we know that there is a cause? Well, the Kalam cosmological argument was developed by a Muslim, the cosmological argument, and I recommend, now this is where we're getting to Craig, I recommend either his more academic book, Reasonable Faith, or if you want his more reader-friendly book, I recommend On Guard. Reader-friendly does not mean it's any less light, it is just as informative, but he does not involve as much of the historical as well as some of the other philosophical things that maybe just aren't needed as much. But if you want a more fully fleshed out, I recommend his Reasonable Faith book. But anyways, the Kalam cosmological argument is one that William and Craig champions, and I do think it's a great argument, and is religiously neutral as well as debate-wise neutral within the church. Everything begins to exist has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. And this is how the logic works, right? You have a premise 1, a premise 2, that leads to a conclusion. And if these premises are true and the conclusion is true, then we have is a sound, cogent argument that is valid. But because these two things follow, the premises lead to the conclusion, which means that this is a valid argument. And the fact that we just went over some of the evidence for everything that their universe had a beginning, and we understand that things that have beginnings usually have a cause, well, then that leads to us having a sound argument here. But let's go a little bit further detail. So this cause, notice I capitalized the C, this cause must be transcendent over space, time, and matter. It's not held down to it. It's not bound to the laws of physics. Physics was created by it. This cause must also be powerful enough to cause the universe to exist. Now I want to stop right here. This is important because right here, let's take the number 4. The number 4, conceptually speaking, is not held by space, time, or matter until you write it down or type it out. But the number 4 is not powerful enough to cause the universe to exist. All right, so we have to understand that it's not just a thing. There has to be something with power. Not only does it have the power, it has to be personal enough to make a choice. It had to be a choice made to cause something to exist with the power it has and to create all these things right here. Space, time, and matter. All right, evidence for a designer. This comes from the fine-tuning or the teleological argument. And I again recommend the same books. I'll have them down in the description below. Every design has a designer. The universe has a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe has a designer. And we see here that the arguments follow, that it makes it a valid argument, and that if we're able to provide some good evidence for it, then we might be able to have a good, not just valid, but sound argument here. But it's based on the idea a watch needs a watchmaker, a car needs an engineer, all those various things. But let's look at some anthropic constants. This will be a good way to look at evidence for a designer. And look at the chances, the probabilities that make it seem like an accident or something just random doesn't really add up. So let's dive in here. Anthropic constant essentially means that things that affect humanity, things that are consistent, that are good for humanity in its survival, or else we would not be here, beginning with oxygen comprising of 21% of the atmosphere. If this is a little bit higher or a little bit less, we either get an eruption of spontaneous fires, or we would, as human beings, begin to suffocate. There's also the atmospheric transparency. If this was a little less transparent, there would not be enough solar radiation, and if it was a little more, we would have too much solar radiation. The relationship between the moon, Earth, and gravity. If this was any greater in the gravitational force between the two, tidal effects on the ocean's atmosphere and rotational period would be severe and problematic for our living. But if it was less, orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities. So you see here that the gravitational pull between the moon and the Earth is actually really, really impactful on our tidal waves as well as our climatic stabilities. And the gravity by itself, I mean, the gravitational force were altered by, let's say, 0.00000000000. You get the idea. To keep adding a bunch of zeros until we get to 1. Try to place a 1 there. This kind of percentage, our sun would not exist, and neither would we, if gravity's forces were different. Then let's also look at Jupiter. And there's so many more of these we could talk about. But if Jupiter, if this was not where it currently is, we would be bombarded by space material. Why? Because of the gravitational force and pull in its atmosphere that redirects these meteorites. And so I would recommend Out of That Faith to be an atheist. He goes, Frank Turk and Norman Geisler go into further detail on page 105 on some more anthropic constants. But these are just some good ones right here. Not only that, but we also have good evidence. We have people like atheists who are admitting the very fact that the body appears to be designed. And if it appears to be designed, well, we should have a good conclusion that there is a designer for such design. So biology also points to the very fact we have a designer. The Earth itself, I mean, there's so many things that are just counter random. They're just really much set as if they were supposed to be structured that way. And you don't need a scientific degree to discover these things. However, if you go further into science and the philosophy of science and listen to the different Christians that are diving into this, they'll show you that the beauty of the design, and even atheists are struggling with the very fact that design is evident. But let's get into some objections here. We'll spend more time here. So I'm going to be going with some of the more common objections. I'm not going to be, some of these I know Christians have different stances on. And you'll see that in the first two. I'm not here to make a case for anything. I'm going to be taking these as if an atheist was throwing this at you, not knowing what your particular stance is. So I'm not going to tell you my stance on this either, but I'm going to be showing you some responses you could be saying to these things, okay? Beginning with the Big Bang Theory. So atheists typically hold to this, and they know that Christians will back up against it because depending on which church background you're coming from and what your beliefs are about Genesis 1 and understand how the relationship between science and Genesis correlates, you'll find that there are definitely Christians who are opposed to this. However, what I will say about the Big Bang Theory in general is while metaphysically atheists try to say that this is its own cause or it is causeless, but it just happened, and they're trying to remove the need for God. This theory was actually developed in 1931 by a Catholic astronomer and priest, Georges Lemaitre. And what's funny about this, or Lemaitre, sorry. And what's funny about this is that he developed this theory thinking about the different logical conclusions that comes from what Hubble was discovering and from what Einstein's theory was implying. And he corrects Einstein's math, and he develops this theory of which atheists were really against this, because if this theory was even plausible, then that leads to a lot of theological implications that there is a God. So he theorized that if the universe is expanding, the further back you go, the smaller it is, and we get to an arrival point. So it's not necessarily saying that there was a big explosion, like a kaboom, but it's really dealing with the idea that there's a point in time when everything began. Now, could there be an explosion for this? That's one way you could interpret that. But his overall theory was the idea that there had to be a beginning point, because if everything's expanded, there had to be a point it's expanding from. And in that beginning would be space-time and matter. So when someone throws, to say, the Big Bang Theory, you can throw some history at them and say, you do realize the atheists were actually against this? It was the church who developed this. Now, maybe not everyone in the church agrees with this theory, but it's not a atheist theory. It's actually a theory from the church, which I just find to be interesting. Macroevolution is another one. Macroevolution, metaphysically, sorry, I lost track of my notes. Metaphysically, tries to attack the idea of a designer and a cause. The issue is one, neo-Darwinianism specifically, which is what a lot of atheists hold to, is not able to deal with the idea of a first species and where it comes from. So while they're trying to develop this theory, the problems are, one, there's not a ton of concrete evidence for macro, but there's a ton of for micro. And I know there can be some out there who can be disagreeing with me on this, that may be Christians. I'm specifically talking about neo-Darwinianism at this point in time. But the Cambrian explosion is a great example of, according to the fossil records, points to an explosive point in time where it seems that many creatures came to existence at the same time. And again, Stephen C. Meyer goes in great detail in his book, Darwin's Doubt, one of his more popular books. He wrote 3. And even if macroevolution was true, it would still be evidence for God, because it requires someone to guide the process. Most recent experiments involve someone being involved in the adaptation process, and that they're the ones kind of controlling the environment, which kind of shows that you need someone to get involved in it. But if you're really against this, one argument I've heard from people that I think is good is this is acronym LIFE. L, limits to change. I, irreducible complexity. F, fossil record. And E, epigenetic information. And limits to change with the fact that there's not a ton of changes from a bunch of species to another species. You see a lot of within their own kinds changing. You see the fact that there's so much complexity to each species, that there's not just like one little thing just changes everything. It is not as simple as some people want it to be. The fossil record, we kind of deal with the Cambrian explosion, and then epigenetic information also kind of is another great one to dive into. But ultimately, I want to say about these two before I continue on. These two theories, while I am not here to prove or disprove that either of these things are true, okay? All I'm trying to say is that these two things right here, they both depend on God. And it's just funny to me that people will try to use these things to counter God, but they actually very heavily depend on God still. So we as Christians need not be scared of these, because if we really just think about the metaphysics behind it, there still has to be a cause for both of these things to begin. Now, I'm not saying that makes it true. I'm not saying the Bible affirms that. I'm also not saying the Bible disproves these either. I'm going to let other people get into that debate. I'm not here to cause those debates. But I'm trying to say is, if you encounter someone who tries to throw these at you as evidence against God, just point out the fact that they both heavily depend on a God to begin these things. So really, atheists have to have a lot of faith in nothing to cause something that requires someone to be involved in. So it's just interesting to me that they try to use this, but they both very much depend on a creator to make these things happen. Does that mean they're true? I'm not saying they are. I'm not saying they aren't. I do have my opinion on both of them about whether or not they're consistent, especially with the text, but neither of them really go against God. They're actually not that problematic for the church. It's just a matter of, are they consistent with biblical records and with the things we're finding in general and special revelation, as well as cultural understanding of beginning and creation from the Israelites when they wrote their texts. Another funny one to me is the multiverse. People will throw this one as supposedly an attack on fine tuning because if there are numerous universes, there was bound to be one that could contain life and house us. So while this may be a quote unquote attack on fine tuning, this is not an attack on the kalam cosmological because the multiverse depends on a cause still. So again, I'm not saying the multiverse is true or false, but it's just funny because they'll throw this one out there saying, "Well, see, God didn't fine tunely design this. But it actually still depends on someone who had to have caused it. So it actually does not remove God from the picture still. So the multiverse, I mean, I don't know where people stand on this in the Christian world. I've not heard Christians talk about this much other than like in science fiction. But needless to say that if it is true or if it isn't true, it doesn't remove God from the equation. Just like the first two, they don't remove God from the equation. It's just they're not good arguments actually. Then we have the eternal universe. We kind of just dealt with this earlier. Eternal universe doesn't really add up with the fact that Hebrews 11, Genesis 1. There's another passage as well. Colossians, I believe, talks about creation a little bit and removes the idea that there was no beginning, that there has to clearly be a beginning to things. Let's go into panspermia. This is an idea that I heard from Dawkins. I can't remember which movie it was, but he mentioned it in a film. The problem is the theory is that aliens made man somehow. They came here, they created man through their own sperm or test tubes or whatever they wanted to do. Whatever the running theory is behind this. One, I'm not going to say if I think if there's evidence for aliens. I do think some of the more recent things tend to be more demonic related, but God could have created something else out there. I wouldn't say they are also in the image of God, but if they do exist, which we don't really have any evidence for right now. So, but no evidence does not mean automatically disproven. It just means that there's no evidence for it. So there's no reason to really grapple onto it. So I know some Christians like to think there's aliens out there, but the thing is that one, if they are, they're not made in God's image like we are, and two, Jesus died for us, not for them. If there are aliens, they're probably more like alien dogs. But anyways, nothing caused. Sorry, the aliens, they still depend on. It's really just kicking a can down the road. You still need a God to have created those aliens who created man. So again, panspermia, well, I'm telling you right now, I do think panspermia is ridiculous. I do think it's a ridiculous theory, and it's not credible. But all it does is kick the can down the road and does not remove for God. Not a single objection to God in this case removes God. In fact, a lot of the objections against God are complaints against God. Big Bang Theory doesn't prove Big Bang Theory doesn't disprove God. Macroevolution doesn't disprove God. Multiverse doesn't disprove God. Eternal universe has been disproven, and panspermia doesn't disprove God. A lot of these either kick the can down the road, or you have to really do some mental gymnastics to get around the fact that God had to have caused these things still. So, in the efforts to say, let's come to this question. With all the evidence, what seems to be more reasonable? Well, we've got two options here. Nothing caused the universe, which means somehow an accident took place, or God caused the universe and everything in it. And I would say that there's a lot of theories I know out there. I do think there's a lot of them that are wrong, specifically within the Christian realm. And I do think there's some that are more credible than others. So I ask you to be careful if you go further into study, especially if you're going to be diving into these things right here. Be careful, because I will tell you, I do think certain one of these are not verifiable and not plausible at all. All I'm saying with these is that none of them remove God from the picture. So these objections to God are ridiculous. I do think very specific ones are ridiculous and need to be removed. And that's just my opinion, but I'm not going to tell you which ones they are. I think you guys should figure it out for yourself, and based on your own opinions and your own convictions with the Lord and His Word. But ultimately, everything, regardless of how ridiculous the theory is, depends on God causing it. In fact, some people say, well, who created God? Well, you're assuming that God is a created being. We'll say, what about the Kalam cosmological argument? Well, no, that's declaring something, anything that has a beginning has a cause, and God has no beginning. So therefore, he is not caused. He exists. But even then, if you were to say, if God created the universe, who created God? Now you're still implying that there, like, while that one who created the universe isn't God, you're still declaring that there is a God. So it only kicks the can down the road. There's not been a single argument that I've found so far that really removes God. I'm sure there's some ones out there that are far trickier. I'm just providing the more popular ones right now. Um, but often I find that a lot of the arguments people have are usually complaints or ones that don't even remove God from the picture at all. So there's that. So, anyways, that's kind of the slideshow for this. I hope this was helpful to at least get you a little more centered in this. Some recommended books I recommend would be Out Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, On Guard, Reasonable Faith, Answer to Demand a Verdict, Return of the God Hypothesis, Darwin's Doubt, and I think that's it for now. And I'll put them all in the description below as well. But these are good books to look into some of these arguments further in depth. Like I said, this is broad strokes apologetics. The point of this is just to get you more associated with some of these, getting your feet wet, but leaving room for you to dive into your own homework with this as well, which we should be doing. This is not a I get to tell you everything and then you get to take it and run from here. No, this is a I get you started and then you can go further into this, come to your own conclusions based on the evidence and the scriptures, and trust in the Lord to guide you down the right direction. All right, so with that, we'll leave it here, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.